Hello, I'm Dawn Durham, and welcome to PaTTANpod. When we think about students receiving special education services, we have to ensure that the intensification of instruction is not isolated and that the alignment between general education and special education is evident. We need to make sure that we're not running two parallel systems between general education and special education, as that benefits no one. We want the interconnectivity between the two. Dr. Johanna Fitzgerald from Mary Immaculate College in Limerick, Ireland is here to help us unpack this topic. Dr. Fitzgerald, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Dawn. I'm absolutely delighted to have a conversation with you.
We're excited to be talking with you, and I want to think about, when we talk about a seamless continuum of supports, what does that mean in regards to the alignment between general education and special education? What's an alignment look like?
Okay, well, I think what that alignment looks like is when you have a whole school approach, a really integrated whole school approach to inclusive and special education. And I think sometimes the word whole school or school-wide is often bandied about without us really considering what a whole school approach to inclusive and special education looks like. And I make the distinction between inclusive and special education because they are distinct. And I think in terms of us exploring special education under the umbrella of inclusive education, we need to acknowledge that it is distinct and different. But in acknowledging the distinctiveness and difference of special education, it creates a tension, and sometimes that tension surfaces when we look at whether or not inclusive education actually does meet the needs of those with special educational needs. Or by virtue of us labeling special education, are we creating discrete, separate systems for some students in the education system? And much of the literature, when you look at, let's say, compare inclusive and special education in America and compare it to what's happening in Europe, there are probably different approaches to how we create that integrated system. And some might say that we haven't, that we have failed. Because, for example, Marlene Kugash, who writes prolifically around inclusive and special education in the States, she might say that we are perhaps watering down special education. And that when we look to creating inclusive education for all, which there is no universal definition of, and nobody can agree on what it is, and Dyson would say that it's very much a local interpretation in schools, then how can we nail down special education when inclusive education is very broad? And I think for some students who have very unique and distinct needs, they do require specialist instruction. They do require instruction from teachers who are appropriately trained in evidence-based and evidence-informed interventions to meet those complex needs. And sometimes when we talk about what inclusive education is, generally where children have an entitlement to be educated alongside their typically developing peers in their local schools, being socially included, being geographically included, but are they receiving an appropriate instruction to their level of need? And some would argue that they're not. And so there's a discontent when you look at some of the literature now, particularly coming out of Europe and in America. America seems to have a different approach. You haven't watered down, you have protected special education. But I don't know what you would think, Dawn. Do you feel by protecting and recognizing special education as a distinct discipline, have we perpetuated this dual cycle of discrete special education and general education? And in Europe, there's a growing discontent on one side that some of our students with more complex needs aren't having those needs met. But on the other side, you have a growing movement towards all children being included in all schools. And there's a real tension there because, like Baroness Warnock, who back in 1975 was a key proponent of developing inclusive education and recognizing that all children should have an entitlement to be educated in their local school, made a U-turn back in 2005 to say that, hang on a sec, maybe we're not actually meeting the instructional needs of some learners with very significant needs, learning needs in the mainstream. But again, when going back to your original question, how do we create an integrated continuum of support where general education and special education are integrated? I think it comes back to a whole school systems level, where schools engage in an ongoing cycle of school self-evaluation across a continuum of support. Do you have the notion in the States of the least restrictive environment?
Yes, we do.
I really like that notion. We don't have that here in Ireland or in Europe, but I really do align with it in that what it recognizes is that for children with complex needs, what you want to do is to give them maximum exposure to their typically developing peers. So to be in their communities, right? While at the same time giving them maximum exposure to an appropriate curriculum and access to learning, where there's a real focus on building skills. And I really like that notion of the least restrictive environment because I think it captures it well. And it also captures that dilemma that we are faced with in recognizing that some students do have distinct needs. And Bram Nord talks about dilemmas of difference, where he says, okay, by giving them something different, are we not segregating them? But if we don't give them something different, how are we meeting their needs? So it is really a balancing act. But I know from my own research, and I do quite a bit of research with schools here in and around Limerick and Clare, where we've been looking at developing that integrated system where we're taking special education in mainstream regular schools, trying to take special education out of this discrete, bolted on place way off down the back of the school where children go to, down there, up there, away from the regular, to look at special education being at the heart of teaching, learning and assessment across the school. So it really is about offering a continuum of provision and looking at and engaging in a whole school process of school self-evaluation, where from the senior leadership team down, school is looking at three things. Number one, how we identify student need at the three levels. So it's support for all. So you have the tiered system as well, don't you?
Yeah. Tier 1 is all students, Tier 2 is some students, Tier 3 is a few students. You got it.
That's what we have. So we have that as well. So really what we're doing is looking at three things where school self-evaluation is concerned. And they engage in an ongoing cycle where they work with staff, they work with the students, and they work with parents. And so it involves, number one, identifying how we're meeting student needs at levels 1, 2, and 3. How we identify the need, how we meet the need. So what provision have we got in place? So engage in provision mapping exercises across the continuum of need from stages 1, 2, and 3, to include the profile of needs that we have for students. And then, so number one is how we identify the needs across the continuum. Number two, how we meet those needs. And number three, how we monitor and review and evaluate whether what we're doing is working to meet the needs of all, some, and few learners in the school. And the focus really is on the all. How do we meet all learners' needs? And it really is about universal design for learning. So it's about how can we build capacity amongst all teachers so that they are working to include the diverse range of students that they have in their classrooms, including those who have special educational needs. And so it really is about looking at that preventative, proactive level 1 intervention because the more we do there, the less those students who have more complex and unique needs need at level 2 and level 3.
You got it. Yeah, I want to highlight a few things that you had talked about. You know, it really does come down to what's good for all students and that really integrated model. And thinking about, and you had said you kind of have this 3-point system, what we would refer to as a problem-solving model. What are the needs? How are we matching those needs? Are we doing it adequately where we're seeing growth and ambitious growth from our students? And one thing, you talked about special education kind of being down the hall. Special education is not a place. It's not a teacher. It's services that are provided to a student who may need that, but it's it's not a place. And I think we need to switch our mindset and our thinking about that. And and that leads me to thinking, as a teacher who's listening to this, how do I ensure that I'm not inadvertently kind of putting off this message that special education's over there? It's not all of us that is really engaged in good practices that are evidence aligned for all students. How do I do that as a teacher?
I think, again, it comes back to whole school systems and putting in systematic collaboration. So providing opportunities for staff to talk to each other. And if you put systems in place, so for example, if staff meet as a whole staff, that things like a discussion around special education are on the agenda all of the time. If in subject departments, that special education is discussed as part of an overall provision within subject departments, that every teacher, because if I think regular teachers, and you see, this is again where the tension emerges, I think, Dawn, and my own research around looking at leadership in special education would have surfaced this. When we create special ed teachers, because and actually in America, you can train at an undergraduate level to be a special education teacher. Isn't that right?
Yes, that is.
Whereas in Europe and in Ireland, the model would be that you train as a general teacher and then you can decide. So everybody gets trained in and around the principles of UDL, Universal Design for Learning, that I'm a teacher of, diverse groups of students. So if we have special education teachers by virtue of having qualifications and expertise in it, and we set up this expert model where your regular teacher might think, well, I don't have that expertise. I haven't done the qualification. So that's Mrs. Jones down the corridor. That's her responsibility because she's done the course and she has the skills to be able to meet the needs. And that creates, again, that chasm between general and special education. And what I would say there is, what's key in a school is building in systematic collaboration. And when we train our special education teachers, we need to also train them in terms of how to lead an integrated whole school approach where they become, and a lot of the research that looks at leadership in special education and the role of special needs coordinators, for example, will say that these teachers need to have really excellent interpersonal skills to be able to interact with their colleagues, to advise them, to coach them. They nearly become that resource for their colleagues to support inclusion in the regular classroom, as opposed to just providing discrete special education in a place.
Yeah,
because you're right. I totally agree with you. It's not about the place. It's about the school's capacity to respond to the need.
It is, and I think that's a great point to make. That we really need to be thinking about systematic collaboration. And building that internal capacity of all teachers, of all leaders, to really become the instructional leaders, the systematic leaders to make that shift and change, so that we are thinking about what you call level 1, 2, and 3. We call tiers 1, 2, and 3 to be thinking all students need high quality, evidence-aligned instruction Some are going to need a little bit more, and a few should need an even more intensification of instruction. But thinking about that collaboration piece to build the capacity, I think, is crucial. I'm so glad that we were able to talk to you today, Dr. Fitzgerald. It's such a joy to be able to hear you and to speak with you and to kind of gain your insight into this, as I know this is work that you do very deeply and are very wedded to. So I'm so glad. If I may ask just one more question, when we think about what our goal here is on PaTTAnpod, we want to inspire others to grow. What advice might you offer to someone to inspire their own educational growth?
I think we're always growing. I think when we look at our education systems across the world, change is the one constant, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And was it Heraclitus said, you never jump into the same river twice, because the water is never the same and you're never the same. Mm-hmm. And I think we always have to be open as educators. We always have to be open to learning, and the whole notion of a learning organization where everybody is learning, and we're always learning, because every day teachers are meeting new children, new challenges, diverse needs. And so if there's an openness to learning and an engagement with self-reflection around, I came out of that class, how did that go for me today? Was Johnny able to access the learning today? Now, if I was to do that again, what would I do differently? If we continue to reflect on our own teaching at a classroom level, individual teacher level, but at a systematic level as well within the school, I think not only will we grow, we will also recognize the need for change as well. So I think just having an openness to learning and recognizing that things will always change and that we're always on a journey of learning will help us to flexibly respond to the immediate needs of our students that have more complex needs in our classroom. So that would be my one piece of advice, Dawn.
I think that's lovely. Being reflective, open to learning, and therefore open to change, because it may bring about change, which is a good thing at times.
Yeah,
wonderful.
And needs-led change, that you've identified a need based on that cycle of evaluation, and that it's informed by that,
Being reflective.
Yeah.
I think that's great advice, so I so appreciate that. And thank you again, Dr. Fitzgerald, for being with us on PaTTAnpod. We're so excited that you were able to join us.
Thank you very much, Dawn, for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here, and best of luck.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you to all of you in the field. You inspire educational growth in your students every day. A special thank you to John Ragsdale for producing this podcast. We'll see you next time on PaTTAnpod.